The boy had forgotten how to ask questions, and Jacob had forgotten why answers mattered. Dawn broke cold and colorless over the Harrison Ranch, high in the Montana Territory Mountains. February had left the world frozen. Everything locked in silence. Jacob moved through the morning chores with mechanical precision. His 8-year-old son Daniel shadowing him like a ghost. They fed the cattle without speaking, mucked the stalls without conversation, carried water buckets in rhythm, their breath making white clouds that disappeared into nothing. The ranch was prosperous, healthy herd, solid barns, good horses in the corral, everything a man could want except the one thing that made wanting matter. Saw. Jacob had built this place for Sarah. She loved the mountain views, the clean air, the way sunrise painted the peaks gold. Now those peaks looked gray to him, and the air felt empty rather than clean. Daniel climbed onto the fence rail to scatter grain for the chickens. The boy moved carefully, as if afraid sudden motion might break something. He'd learned that 8 months ago when everything actually did break. Just when Mama went into the bedroom to have the baby and never came back out. He and Asar. When Papa stopped talking, and they buried 2 people in one cold afternoon. They walked to the house in silence. Jacob glanced at the garden plot near the porch, Sarah's garden, now just dead stalks under dirty snow. He should clear it. Should prepare it for spring planting. Should do a lot of things he couldn't make himself care about. Inside, the kitchen felt cavernous. One lamp burned on the counter. The rest of the house stayed dark. Jacob unwrapped 2 cold biscuits left from yesterday. Handed one to Daniel. They ate standing up. The dining table sat in the corner under a layer of dust. Its chairs pushed in. Unused. Daniel stared at that table for a long moment, then quickly looked away. The boy had learned not to want what he couldn't have. Had learned that tables were for before, and cold biscuits standing up were for now. Had learned his father couldn't bear the weight of his questions, so he'd stopped asking them. Jacob saw that look, that quick turn away, and felt something twist in his chest. Some small voice whispered that this wasn't protecting Daniel. That silence wasn't safety. But he didn't know how to do anything else. Didn't know how to be a father when being a husband had been torn away. Didn't know how to set a table for 2 when it had always been set for 3, and now should have been 4. So he kept them moving, kept them working, kept them breathing and eating and sleeping, which was all he could manage. "We'll ride the north fence line today," Jacob said, his voice rough from disuse. "Check for winter damage." "IB," Daniel nodded without speaking. He was always ready to follow. Never asked where they were going or why. Just put on his coat and walked out the door behind his father, quiet as a shadow. They spent the morning in the saddle, riding between fence posts, checking wire. The work was mindless, which suited Jacob fine. His hands knew what to do, even when his mind wandered into places he tried not to go. Sarah's laugh, the baby's name they'd chosen together, the future they'd planned. He shook his head hard, forcing those thoughts back into the locked box where he kept them. Mid-morning, Daniel pointed down the mountain toward the main trail. A covered wagon sat stopped on the path below. Listing to one side, a woman walked away from it, up the long drive toward their ranch house. Jacob's stomach tightened. Company, the last thing he wanted. But mountain code didn't give him a choice. You didn't turn away someone in need. Not up here where winter could kill, and neighbors were scarce. He touched his heels to his horse and headed down. The woman stopped halfway up the drive when she saw them riding toward her. She didn't wave or call out, just stood waiting with her hands loose at her sides. Something about her stillness suggested she wouldn't beg and wouldn't waste words. Jacob reined up a few yards away. She was mid-30s, he guessed, with travel-worn clothes and clear eyes that took his measure without apology. Her dark hair was pulled back practical, and dust covered her skirts from hard miles. My wagon broke an axle about half a mile down, she said without preamble. I need shelter while I arrange repairs. There's a wheelwright in Silver Creek, but he won't come up here for 3 days at least. Jacob nodded slowly. You can use the barn. I'll need the house, she said evenly. I have supplies that can't freeze. Something in Jacob bristled at her directness, but he recognized necessity when he heard it. 3 days. That's what the wheelwright said when I sent word yesterday from the trading post. Daniel's horse shifted beneath him, and the woman's gaze moved to the boy. Her expression softened just a fraction. You've got a fine son there. Jacob's jaw tightened. The house has a spare room upstairs. You can use it. I appreciate that. She extended her hand. Emma Hartley. He shook it briefly. Jacob Harrison. This is Daniel. Emma nodded to the boy, who ducked his head and looked away. She didn't push, just turned back to Jacob. And I'll need help moving my things up from the wagon, and I'll cook while I'm here. You don't need to... I'll stay. Emma interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. But only if you let me cook for you both and you join us for meals. All of us. At the table. Jacob felt his defenses slam up like a wall. This wasn't the bargain. Shelter was one thing. Sitting at that table, making conversation, pretending normalcy that was something else entirely. That's not necessary, he said. It is for me. Emma's eyes held his steadily. I don't take charity without giving something back. And I won't eat alone in a house full of people. Those are my terms. I'd mend the hut. Jacob opened his mouth to refuse. To tell her she could sleep in the barn after all. Mountain code be damned. But Daniel shifted in his saddle, and Jacob caught the look on his son's face. Not quite hope. The boy had learned better than hope, but something close. Curiosity. Maybe interest in this stranger who looked at him like he was a person instead of a problem. Wamo Hayed. Mountain honor fought with stubborn grief. Honor won by a hair. 3 days. Jacob said, Then you're gone. Fair enough. Emma's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes' satisfaction. Maybe. Or calculation. I'll get my things. Jacob dismounted and handed his reins to Daniel. Take the horses to the barn. Give them extra feed. As Daniel rode off, Jacob followed Emma down the trail to her wagon. The broken axle was obvious. The wheel canted at a severe angle. She'd managed to unload most of her supplies and stack them beside the trail, covering them with canvas. They worked in silence, carrying boxes and bags up the long drive. Emma didn't make small talk or ask questions. She just lifted her share and walked, steady and strong. Jacob found himself grudgingly approving of her competence. On the third trip, Emma paused at the garden plot, looking at the dead stalks under snow. That'll come back beautiful in spring, she said quietly. Jacob didn't answer. He shifted the box in his arms and kept walking. Inside, Emma took in the dark house, the single lamp, the dust on the furniture. Her gaze lingered on the unused table, then moved to the narrow stairs. I'll take the room at the top. Yes. She climbed the stairs with her bags. Jacob stood in the kitchen, already regretting his agreement. 3 days of sitting at that table. 3 days of pretending he was something other than a man going through motions. He heard Emma moving around upstairs, settling in. Daniel came in from the barn, stopped in the doorway, uncertain. Wash up, Jacob said. I suppose we're eating at the table tonight. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Then he nodded and headed for the washstand. Jacob looked at the dusty table and felt 8 months of grief pressing against his ribs like a fist. Emma came downstairs as the afternoon light began to fail. She changed into a clean dress and tied an apron around her waist. Without asking permission. She moved through Jacob's kitchen like she had every right, opening cupboards, assessing supplies, building up the fire in the stove. Jacob watched from the doorway, jaw tight. Daniel sat on the bottom stair, also watching. Neither of them spoke. You've got good stores, Emma said, not looking at them. Beans, flour, some dried beef, onions in the cellar. She glanced over her shoulder at Jacob. Yes. I'll make stew then. There's cornbread makings too. She worked with quiet efficiency. Peeling onions. Cutting beef into small pieces. Measuring flour. Her movements were practiced, confident. Sarah used to move like that in this kitchen, humming while she worked. Jacob felt the comparison like a blade. He made himself walk outside, stood on the porch in the cold, breathing hard. This was a mistake. Having a woman in the house, cooking Sarah's recipes, filling Sarah's space. 3 days felt like 3 years. But when full dark came and the smell of stew drifted through the open door, his stomach reminded him they'd been eating cold biscuits and jerky for months. Real food. Warm food. His body betrayed his resistance with hunger. Daniel appeared at his elbow. Papa, Miss Emma says it's ready. Jacob looked down at his son. The boy's face held careful neutrality, but his eyes asked a question. Are we really going to do this? Go wash your face. Jacob said, inside. The kitchen blazed with light. Emma had lit 3 lamps, and the space glowed warm and golden. The table that dusty, abandoned table was set with 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 spoons. She'd found Sarah's good tablecloth somewhere and spread it clean and white. Jacob's throat closed. Emma ladled stew into bowls. Steam rose, smelling of onions and beef, and something that might have been thyme. She set cornbread in the center, butter beside it. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down, looking at them expectantly. Daniel glanced at Jacob. Jacob forced himself to move, to pull out his old chair, to sit. The wood felt foreign under him. How long since he'd sat here? 8 months. 8 months since the last normal dinner, when Sarah was heavy with child and laughing at something Daniel said, and the world made sense. Daniel took his usual seat carefully, like it might collapse under him. Shall we say grace? Emma asked. Jacob's hands clenched on the table edge, but he nodded, bowed his head. Heard Emma's voice speaking simple thanks for food and shelter and the kindness of strangers. When she finished, Daniel whispered, Amen. Jacob said nothing. They ate in near silence. Emma asked Daniel about the animals. The boy's answers came out whispered and short. What's your favorite? The horses, ma'am. You ride well. I saw you this morning. Daniel's cheeks colored slightly. Papa taught me. He's a good teacher, then. Emma glanced at Jacob, who stared at his stew. She didn't push. Instead, she told a story about a mule she'd known back east who refused to pull a plow until someone sang to him. Ashiner Doc Stel. Her voice was gentle, slightly humorous. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. Jacob saw it that tiny lift at the corners of his son's mouth and felt something crack inside him. Gratitude. resentment, relief, anger. He didn't know which one to feel, so he felt all of them at once. A knot of confusion that made his hands shake, Emma noticed. She finished her story and stood to clear plates. "I'll do the washing up. You two probably have evening chores." It was a dismissal disguised as courtesy. Jacob took it. He pushed back from the table and walked out without a word. Daniel followed after a moment's hesitation. They did the evening feeding in darkness, working by lamplight in the barn. Daniel kept glancing at his father, questions clearly building behind his careful silence. Finally, "Is she staying? Papa for real?" 3 days, Jacob said. "Then she's gone." Daniel nodded, but that almost smile lingered at the edges of his expression when they came back inside. Emma had cleaned everything and retired upstairs, but the kitchen still glowed with light from 3 lamps. And in the center of the table, she'd left the second lamp burning, the one Jacob hadn't lit in 8 months. He stood looking at it for a long time. That extra light felt exposing, almost painful. It showed dust he'd ignored, cobwebs in corners, all the small neglects of grief. But he didn't extinguish it. Instead, he sent Daniel to bed and sat alone at the table, watching that flame flicker. Upstairs, he heard Emma moving around, heard the creak of bed springs. The sound of another person in the house felt alien, wrong, like an intrusion into the private space of his morning. But when Daniel started singing softly to himself in his room, some song Emma must have taught him during the day Jacob closed his eyes and let himself feel something besides grief, just for a moment. Just enough to hurt, the rooster woke Jacob before dawn. Same as always. But when he came downstairs, the kitchen already smelled of coffee and bacon. Emma stood at the stove, dressed and efficient, humming something under her breath. "Morning," she said without turning. "Coffee's ready." Jacob poured himself a cup and stood by the window, watching the sky lighten behind him. Emma cracked eggs into a pan. The sizzle and pop of cooking filled the silence he'd grown accustomed to. It felt loud, intrusive. Daniel came down, rubbing his eyes. He stopped when he saw the table set for breakfast. Real breakfast eggs. Bacon. Biscuits with butter and jam. His eyes went round. "Sit," Emma said. "Growing boys need proper food." They sat. They ate. Emma asked Daniel about school. "We don't go to school anymore," Daniel said quietly. "Papa teaches me here." "What are you learning?" Daniel looked to Jacob, uncertain. Jacob shrugged. The boy turned back to Emma. "Reading, arithmetic, about the ranch and animals." "That's good learning." Emma refilled Jacob's coffee without asking. "I used to teach school back in Pennsylvania before I headed west." This was the first personal information she'd offered. Jacob found himself curious despite his resistance. Why'd you leave?" Emma's hands stilled briefly on the coffee pot. "Lost my husband to fever 3 years back. Lost the school position after. Seemed like a good time for a new start. Widow." Then, that explained some of her understanding. The way she looked at their grief without flinching. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered. Emma smiled at him. Thank you. Sweet boy. But it gets easier. Not all the way easy, but easier. You learn to carry it without it crushing you." Jacob's jaw tightened. He stood abruptly. "We've got work to do." He walked out before Emma could respond. Outside, the morning felt less suffocating than the kitchen, with its cooking smells and gentle conversation. He saddled his horse with rough movements, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling of being seen. But when Daniel came out to do chores, the boy was humming that song from last night. And when Emma appeared at the barn door asking to see the chickens, Daniel lit up and eagerly showed her the nesting boxes. Explaining which hens laid best and which ones were broody, Jacob watched from the shadows. His silent, careful son, chattering like a normal boy, pointing and explaining and almost laughing when a hen pecked at Emma's outstretched hand. We saw him and get. Something in Jacob's chest twisted hard. Gratitude warred with fury. This woman had walked into their grief and acted like joy was still possible. Like life could just continue. Like Sarah's absence was a thing you could work around instead of a hole that swallowed everything. She had no right. At midday, Emma brought them lunch in the barn. Cold chicken and fresh bread. She sat on a hay bale and ate with them, telling Daniel about different chickens she'd known, their personalities and quirks. Daniel hung on every word. Jacob ate in silence, feeling invaded and rescued at the same time. That afternoon, Emma mended Daniel's torn shirt without being asked. She sat in Sarah's rocking chair on the porch. Sarah's chair with needle and thread, humming while she worked. Jacob saw her from the corral and felt rage flash hot through him, but he didn't tell her to move, didn't tell her to stop. He just turned away and worked until his muscles ached and his anger turned to exhaustion. At dinner, Emma told them about her journey west, the people she'd met, the strange towns, the beauty of the plains. She spoke of loss without drowning in it, of moving forward without forgetting. Her words were gentle, but they landed like accusations in Jacob's ears. I learned something hard on this journey, she said. Looking between them, loneliness makes everything hurt worse, not better. I thought if I just kept to myself, grief wouldn't touch me so deep. But isolation feeds grief, gives it room to grow. Jacob set down his fork. That's not always true, isn't it? Emma's eyes held his steadily. I'm not saying grief isn't real or shouldn't be honored. I'm saying we're not meant to carry it alone, he wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her she didn't understand. That his grief was different. That silence protected Daniel from more pain, but the words stuck. Because Daniel was looking at him with something in his eyes Jacob hadn't seen in months. Not quite hope, but maybe the memory of hope. The possibility of it. That night, after Daniel went to bed, Jacob heard his son singing that spring song softly to himself. The sound drifted through the house like something alive and growing. Jacob sat at the table in the lamplight and felt his fortress walls begin to crack. Morning brought news. The wheelwright was delayed. 5 days now. Not 3. Emma delivered this information while serving breakfast. Her voice neutral. I can pay extra for board, she offered. No need. Jacob heard himself say. Then, because it felt like surrender. 2 more days won't matter, but they did matter. Each day Emma stayed. The house felt less like a tomb, and more like something that used to be a home. She opened curtains Jacob had kept closed, swept floors he'd ignored, sang while she worked, filling silence with sound. Daniel bloomed under her attention like a plant finally given water. The 3rd morning of Emma's stay, she asked Daniel to help her with something in the garden. Jacob watched from the kitchen window as they walked out together. The boy asking questions, Emma answering patiently. They knelt in the snow beside Sarah's dead garden plot. Emma had brought a spade. Together, they began clearing away the dead stalks and frozen debris. Jacob's hands tightened on his coffee cup. That was Sarah's garden. Sacred ground, a memorial to everything lost. But Daniel was talking, actually talking. Full sentences with inflection and gesture, telling Emma about the garden when Mama was alive, how she grew tomatoes and beans and zucchini, how she let him help water, how she said gardens were about hope, about planting things and believing they'd grow. Emma listened like every word mattered, nodded, and asked questions, and told Daniel his mama sounded wonderful. And Daniel smiled. Not almost smiled. Actually smiled. Jacob's throat closed. He set down the cup and gripped the counter, watching his son remember Sarah without breaking, without crying, without the careful neutrality that had become his only expression. Emma said something that made Daniel laugh, an actual laugh, bright and young. The sound carried through the window like music. Jacob felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain. Exactly. Or not just pain. Something else. The possibility of healing. The terrifying, fragile chance that maybe Emma was right. Maybe loneliness did make everything worse. Maybe isolation wasn't protecting Daniel. Maybe it was smothering him. He watched them plant early peas, preparing soil for spring that would come whether Jacob was ready or not. That evening, Emma drew Jacob into conversation about the ranch, asked about his plans for spring calving, about water rights and grazing rotation, questions that showed she understood ranching, that she'd listened and learned. Jacob found himself talking, really talking, explaining his breeding program, the challenges of mountain winters, his hopes for expanding the herd. Words came easier than they had in months. Emma listened with genuine interest, asked smart questions, made suggestions that showed she'd thought about it. For the first time since Sarah died, Jacob felt like Jacob. Not just a broken thing surviving, not just a father trying to shield his son, but a man with thoughts and plans and knowledge worth sharing. The conversation stretched through dinner and into the evening. Daniel sat between them, eyes moving back and forth like he was watching something miraculous. When Emma finally excused herself to bed, Jacob sat alone at the table and felt the silence differently. Not comfortable like it had been, but empty, hollow. He realized with sudden clarity that he'd been punishing himself, starving himself of connection because he thought he deserved the pain, thought grief required isolation to be authentic. But Daniel didn't deserve that punishment. Daniel needed more than survival. Jacob stood and walked to Sarah's grave beside the garden. The headstone was simple, carved with her name and dates that didn't come close to containing who she'd been. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "Don't know how to live without you, and still live at all." The wind stirred, carrying the first hint of warmth. Spring coming. Ready or not, Jacob closed his eyes, tried to imagine what Sarah would say. She'd probably tell him to stop being stubborn, to let Emma help, to let Daniel heal, to stop dying alongside her. He stood there a long time, cold seeping through his jacket. When he finally walked back inside, all the lamps were lit, and the house glowed warm against the darkness. Jacob woke the next morning with decision hardening in his gut. This had gone too far. Emma was changing things, routines, rhythms, the careful distance he'd built. Daniel was getting attached, getting hopeful. And when she left, that hope would crush him. Better to pull back now. Better to remind his son that people left, that loss was the only certainty. Better to prepare him for the inevitable disappointment than let him believe in something temporary. At breakfast, Jacob was curt, answered Emma's questions with single words, avoided her eyes. "Daniel and I are riding out to the far pastures today," he announced. "Checking fence lines. We'll be gone most of the day." Emma's hands stilled on the coffee pot. "I could pack you lunch." "We'll manage." Something flickered across her face. Hurt. Quickly banked. She set down the pot and nodded. Of course. They rode out after breakfast. Saddlebags packed with jerky and cold biscuits. Daniel kept looking back at the house, confusion clear in his expression. The day stretched long and cold. Jacob kept them moving, finding more fence to check, more work to do. They ate in the saddle, stayed in the far pastures until the sun touched the mountains. "Shouldn't we go back?" Daniel asked as afternoon faded. Miss Emma will have dinner ready. We'll eat when we're done. They missed dinner entirely. By the time they rode back, full dark had fallen and the house sat quiet. Emma had left a covered pot on the stove stew. Still warm, but she'd gone upstairs. No conversation. No gentle questions. Just the silence Jacob had convinced himself he preferred. He and Daniel ate standing at the counter. The stew tasted like guilt. That night. A spring storm blew in. Late snow. Heavy and wet. Driven by brutal wind. Jacob lay in bed listening to it rage and thought about Emma's wagon. Still exposed on the trail. The repairs hadn't been finished yet. Snow could damage supplies, compromise the canvas cover. He tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem. But mountain code ran deeper than stubbornness. Near midnight. He dressed and went out into the storm. The wind cut through his jacket. Snow stinging his face. He saddled his horse and rode down the dark trail to where Emma's wagon sat half-fixed. Working by lantern light, he secured the canvas, moved the wagon closer to shelter, checked that everything was protected. His fingers went numb, snow soaked through his clothes. But he worked until satisfied nothing would be lost. When he rode back to the house, Emma stood in the kitchen. She'd made coffee, had towels ready. Their eyes met across the room. And Jacob saw understanding there. Saw her recognize what he couldn't say. I'm afraid. I'm terrified of caring. I'm protecting us by pushing you away before losing you destroys us. Thank you, she said quietly, handing him coffee. He wrapped his frozen hands around the cup. Wanted to say something. I'm sorry. I'm scared. Please don't give up on us. But the words wouldn't come. Emma touched his shoulder briefly. You're a good man. Jacob Harrison. Even when you're trying not to be. She went upstairs. Jacob stood dripping in the kitchen, feeling everything he'd tried to wall away pressing against his chest. The next morning, Daniel was withdrawn again, quiet at breakfast. No questions, no chattering. Just the careful neutrality that had been his armor for 8 months. Jacob watched his son shut down and realized what his fear had cost. He'd taught Daniel to protect himself by not hoping, not trusting, not reaching for connection. He'd taught him that isolation was safety. He'd taught him wrong. Emma saw it too. Her eyes met Jacob's across the table. And the message in them was clear. You're running out of time. Fix this before it's too late. The telegram arrived mid-morning. Delivered by a writer from Silver Creek. Emma read it standing in the kitchen, her face going still. My sister in Oregon. She said quietly. She's taken ill. Needs me sooner. Jacob's stomach dropped. How soon? The wheelwright sent word too. He'll be here tomorrow. Says he can finish the repairs in a few hours. Emma folded the telegram carefully. I'll need to leave tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow. 1 day left. Daniel appeared in the doorway. He'd heard. His face went white, then carefully blank. Is everyone leaving? He whispered. Then, louder. Does everyone always leave? Before Jacob could answer, Daniel turned and ran. The door slammed behind him. Emma moved to follow, but Jacob stopped her. Let me. He found Daniel in the barn, curled in the hay beside the horses. Crying, truly crying for the first time since Sarah died, shoulders shaking. Face buried in his arms. Small body racked with sobs. Jacob knelt beside him, put a hand on his son's back. Mama's not coming back. Daniel sobbed. And now Emma's leaving too, and we'll be alone again. Papa, I hate being alone. I hate it so much. The words hit like bullets, each one precise and devastating. Jacob pulled his son into his arms and felt his own walls finally, completely shatter. He'd thought he was protecting Daniel. Thought isolation was a shield. But he'd just been teaching his boy to survive without living, to endure without hoping, to exist without connection. He'd been killing them both slowly. "I'm sorry," Jacob whispered, his own tears starting. "I'm so sorry. Daniel." I thought, if we didn't let anyone in, we couldn't get hurt again. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. They held each other and cried. For Sarah, for the baby who never drew breath, for 8 months of frozen silence, for all the dinners eaten alone, all the questions unasked, all the love locked away, because love meant risk. Finally, Daniel pulled back. His face was red and tear-stained, but his eyes held something new. Not hope exactly, but honesty. Raw and real. "I miss Mama," he said. "But I miss you too. Papa, you're still here, but you're gone. You're a ghost like me." Truth from a child's mouth. Undeniable. Jacob cupped his son's face. "Not anymore. I promise, no more ghosts." They walked back to the house together. Emma stood at the stove, clearly trying not to cry herself. When she saw their faces, both tear-stained, both open, she set down her spoon and opened her arms. Daniel went to her, wrapped his arms around her waist and held on. Emma's hands came up to stroke his hair, and she looked at Jacob over his head, with eyes full of understanding and sorrow, and something that might have been pride. Jacob stepped forward. "Thank you," he said, voice rough, "for showing us we're still alive, for teaching us we still need people, for not giving up on us even when I made it hard." "You weren't hard," Emma said softly. "You were hurting. There's a difference." "The wheelwright comes tomorrow." Jacob swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "But tonight we're together. Let's make it count." They cooked together, all three. Emma taught Daniel how to make biscuits properly. Jacob told stories about Sarah he'd been afraid to speak aloud. Emma shared memories of her own husband, laughing and crying at once. They set the table with Sarah's good dishes, lit every lamp in the house, made the kitchen glow like a celebration. Over dinner, they talked about everything, the people they'd loved, the grief that had nearly buried them, the slow, frightening work of healing. Emma told them about her sister in Oregon, about starting over, about learning to believe in tomorrow again. You taught me something." Jacob said, "You showed up and demanded we sit at a table together. Demanded we stop hiding. You made us see that isolation wasn't protecting us. It was just another kind of dying." Emma's eyes shone with tears. "You taught me something too. You reminded me that helping others helps yourself heal, that sharing life even briefly matters, that we're all in this together, carrying what we've lost and hoping for what might come." After dinner, they played cards. Daniel taught Emma the game Sarah used to play with him, stumbling over the rules, laughing at his own mistakes. The sound of his laughter filled the house like light. When Emma finally went upstairs to pack, Jacob tucked Daniel into bed. His son looked up at him with clear eyes. "Papa, can we keep doing this? Even when Emma leaves, can we keep having dinners together and talking and not being ghosts?" "Yes," Jacob promised, Yes, we can. I think Mama would like that. Jacob kissed his son's forehead. I think you're right. He went downstairs and sat at the table, looking at the 3 plates they'd used, the crumbs of biscuits, the coffee cups, evidence of life, of connection, of the slow, brave work of opening hearts that grief had tried to close. Tomorrow, Emma would leave. Tomorrow they'd be 2 again instead of 3. But they wouldn't go back to silence. Wouldn't return to cold biscuits and dust and closed curtains. They'd remember what Emma taught them, that healing happens in community, that love is worth the risk, that life demands participation, not just endurance. Tomorrow would be hard, but it wouldn't be the end. The wheelwright arrived at dawn, efficient and quick. He had Emma's wagon rolling again by mid-morning. She loaded her supplies while Jacob and Daniel helped, all 3 moving in heavy silence. Schathborn. Everything was ready by noon. Emma settled her accounts, tied down the canvas, checked the horses. Daniel stood beside the wagon, tears sliding down his face without sound. Emma knelt before him. You're going to be all right. Sweet boy. You and your papa, you're going to be more than all right. I don't want you to go. I know, but my sister needs me. We need you too. Emma's face crumpled. She pulled Daniel close, held him tight. You have each other. That's what matters most. Promise me you'll keep talking. Keep sitting at that table together. Keep letting people in. Daniel nodded against her shoulder. Emma stood and looked at Jacob. He wanted to say something. Wanted to tell her what she'd done for them, how she'd saved them without knowing how lost they'd been, but his throat closed around the words. I'll ride with you to Silver Creek. He heard himself say, make sure the wagon holds. It was a transparent excuse. The wagon was fine. But Emma just nodded. I'd like that. Jacob saddled his horse. Daniel hugged Emma one more time, then stepped back beside the house, small and alone. Jacob's heart twisted. But he touched his heels to his horse and rode down the trail beside Emma's wagon. They traveled in silence for a while. The morning was clear and bright, snow melting on the slopes, water running in new streams, spring coming fast now. You're going to miss her, Emma said quietly. Sarah, you'll always miss her, but missing her and living your life, those things aren't opposites. They can exist together. Jacob nodded. I know that now. Took you barging in to teach me. Emma smiled. You were ready to learn. You just needed someone to give you permission. They reached Silver Creek by early afternoon. Emma pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store. Jacob dismounted and stood by her wheel, looking up at her. Your son is special, Emma said. Don't let grief make him grow up too fast. Let him be a boy. Find people. Join the community. Let them in. I will? Jacob gripped the wagon side. And Emma, thank you. For everything. For your condition about the table. For refusing to let us hide. For showing us we could survive grief without disappearing into it. Where's sta? Ikaf bail dana. You would have found your way eventually. Maybe. But you made it faster. Made it less lonely. He took a breath. I know your sister needs you. I know you got a life waiting in Oregon. But he stopped. Couldn't finish. Too much to ask. Too presumptuous. But Emma leaned down, eyes bright. But what? Jacob. The words came in a rush. Stay. not as a traveler, not as someone passing through. Stay because Daniel laughs when you're there. Stay because the house has been dead and you brought it back to life. Stay because we're family now. If you'll have us. Stay because... His voice broke. He started again. Simpler. Stay because we need you. Because I need you. Not just for Daniel. For me. Please. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She looked at him, this broken, brave man who'd finally learned to ask for what he needed, and smiled through her crying. My sister has 3 daughters and a husband, she said softly. She'll be fine with good doctoring. But you and Daniel, you need someone who will stay, someone who'll keep lighting those lamps and setting that table. Is that a yes? That's a yes. Jacob Harrison. I'll stay. The relief that flooded through him was physical. He reached up and Emma took his hand. Squeezed it hard. We should go tell Daniel, she said. Before he thinks we've abandoned him. They turned the wagon around and headed back up the mountain. When they crested the rise, Daniel was standing on the porch, small and alone, watching the trail, waiting. Then he saw them both returning, and his face transformed. Pure joy. Bright and unguarded. He jumped off the porch and ran down the drive, whooping like a wild thing. Jacob spurred his horse forward to meet him. Yehaimon, Bandanikada, swept his son up into the saddle and held him, while Daniel laughed and cried at once. Emma pulled the wagon up beside them, eyes shining. I hope you don't mind house guests who stay forever. I don't mind, Daniel said, grinning through tears. I don't mind at all. Asuri. They rode back to the house together, father, son. And the woman who'd taught them that family isn't just what you're born with. It's who you choose, who you open your heart to, who you let in when every instinct says to hide. The house waited on the mountainside. Windows open, curtains pulled back, light spilling out into the afternoon. Home. Finally, home again. 2 months later. The garden exploded with life. Emma and Daniel worked the rows in early morning sunlight, weeding between the peas and early lettuce, planning where to put tomatoes and beans. Daniel chattered constantly now, full of questions and observations and stories that tumbled out faster than Emma could answer. Miss Emma, look at this one. It's growing faster than all the others. That's because you've been watering it extra. Plants know when they're loved. Jacob watched from the porch, coffee cup warm in his hands. The scene would have broken him 3 months ago. Sarah's garden, come back to life with another woman's hands. But now he just felt grateful, felt the rightness of it. Emma wasn't replacing Sarah. She was her own person. Practical, where Sarah had been dreamy. Direct, where Sarah had been gentle. Different love. Not lesser. Not better. Just different. And that was all right. The house had transformed. Curtains stayed open now, letting sun flood the rooms. All the lamps burned at night, making the place glow. Music returned, Emma playing the old piano in the parlor, teaching Daniel songs. Jacob sometimes joining with his rough voice. They rode into Silver Creek 3 times a week now. Daniel had lessons with the school teacher, made friends with other ranch children. Jacob joined the Cattlemen's Association, attended town meetings, slowly rejoined the world he'd abandoned. People had been kind about his grief, but they were kinder about his return to life. Tonight a neighbor was coming for dinner, Frank Peterson, who ran cattle in the valley below. He wanted to discuss a breeding partnership, sharing bulls to strengthen both herds. Business. Yes. but also friendship, community, the slow rebuilding of normal life. Emma came inside, brushing dirt from her skirts. "We'll have fresh peas for dinner. First of the season. Sarah always said first peas were good luck." Emma smiled. "Smart woman. You're Sarah." They worked together preparing dinner. Daniel set the table 4 places now. No longer strange and arranged wildflowers Emma had shown him how to pick. The boy sang while he worked. Some nonsense song about chickens that made no sense but held pure joy. Jacob carved the roast while Emma mashed potatoes. They moved around each other with practiced ease, comfortable in shared space. "Are you glad your wagon broke?" Daniel asked suddenly, looking at Emma with his direct child's gaze. Emma's hands stilled. She looked at Jacob, and something passed between them. Understanding, gratitude, love that had grown slowly from shared grief and daily life. "Gladder than I can say, sweet boy." "Me too," Daniel said. Then softer, "I think Mama would be glad too, that we're not sad all the time anymore." Jacob's throat tightened, but he managed to nod. "Your Mama wanted us to live. Son, really live, not just exist." Emma came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Solid and real and here. "She sounds like she was very wise." "She was," Jacob said. "She'd like you. I wish I could have known her." "You know us," Daniel said with child logic. "And we're part of her." "So kind of you do know her." Emma pulled the boy into a hug. Jacob wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood that way for a moment of family. Strange and new and chosen. Frank arrived just after sunset, bringing his wife Margaret and their daughter Lucy. The house filled with voices and laughter. "Den for all the boys why." They ate around the table, 6 people now, conversation flowing easily. Talk of cattle and weather and children. Margaret asked Emma about the garden. Lucy showed Daniel a grasshopper she'd caught. Normal. Beautifully, gloriously normal. After dinner, the adults sat on the porch with coffee while the children chased fireflies in the twilight. Frank and Jacob discussed the breeding partnership. "Are they all going to buy?" Margaret and Emma traded recipes and talked about quilting. "You know, dot why?" Jacob looked at his house windows glowing gold, full of light and life and people. "Bestomber Calfuar High," looked at his son running free, laughing. Being a boy again instead of a ghost. Looked at Emma, her profile soft in the lamplight, her voice warm as she talked. "Dexaudi Bidink Phi," and for the first time since the winter of his grief, Jacob Harrison believed in spring again, not just in the valley, but in his own heart. The night deepened. Stars came out, brilliant in the clear mountain sky. Frank and Margaret loaded Lucy into their wagon, promising to return soon. Daniel went to bed, tired and happy. Already asleep before his head touched the pillow, Jacob and Emma stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the mountains. "Thank you," Jacob said quietly, "for staying, for not giving up on us." Emma leaned against his shoulder. "Thank you for letting me, for opening your door, when every instinct said to keep it closed. Best decision I ever made." Inside. The lamp still burned. The table was littered with dishes and glasses and the warm debris of shared life. In the morning, they'd clean it together, Daniel helping. Then they'd start another day feeding animals, tending garden, living. Just living. And that, Jacob finally understood, was enough, was everything, was the whole point. He took Emma's hand, and they walked inside together, closing the door on the darkness and the cold, stepping into light and warmth and the ongoing, everyday miracle of chosen family.